Welcome to the Story Lab. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's begin. Another day, another dollar. That's what they say, right? But for me, Marshall Hopkins, it's more than that. It's about the satisfaction of a job well done, the respect of my colleagues, and the warmth of coming home to my wife, Kathleen. I pulled into our driveway, waving at old Mrs. Johnson watering her roses next door. Evening, Mrs. Johnson. Those roses are looking mighty fine this year. She beamed at me. Oh, Marshall, you always know just what to say. How was work today? Busy as always, I replied, grabbing my briefcase from the passenger seat. But that's the way I like it. Keep safe now. As I walked up to our front door, I couldn't help but smile. This was the life I'd worked hard for, a good job, a nice house in a friendly neighborhood, and a loving wife waiting for me inside. I stepped through the door, the familiar scent of home enveloping me. Honey, I'm home, I called out, setting my briefcase down and loosening my tie. Kathleen appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. Welcome home, dear, she said, giving me a quick peck on the cheek. Dinner's almost ready. Why don't you freshen up? I nodded, heading upstairs to change out of my work clothes. As I came back down, I noticed the trash was full. I'll take this out before dinner, I called to Kathleen. Thanks, hon, she replied from the kitchen. I grabbed the bag and headed out to the bins at the side of the house. As I lifted the lid to toss the bag in, something caught my eye. There, sitting right on top of the garbage already in the bin, were several used condoms. My heart stopped. My mind raced. What the hell? We didn't use condoms. We've been trying for a baby for months now. With shaking hands, I reached in and picked one up, examining it closely. It was definitely used, and definitely not mine. The size alone told me that. What the fuck? I muttered under my breath, anger and confusion warring inside me. I stormed back into the house, condoms still in hand. Kathleen was setting the table, humming to herself as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't just shattered our entire world. Kathleen, I said, my voice low and dangerous. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw what I was holding. What the fuck is this? She froze for a moment, then to my utter disbelief, she smirked. Just look at the size of it, she said dismissively. I couldn't resist. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Couldn't resist? Are you fucking kidding me? I exploded. We're married, Kathleen. We've been trying for a baby, and you're out there fucking some other guy? Kathleen crossed her arms, looking annoyingly calm. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Marshall. It's not like you were getting the job done. Getting the job done? I repeated incredulously. Is that all this is to you? A job? She rolled her eyes. Come on, Marshall. Did you really think our sex life was enough? A girl has needs, you know? I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my anger in check. And what about our vows? What about trust and loyalty? Do those mean nothing to you? They mean plenty, she shot back. But so does satisfaction. Something you clearly can't provide. I was about to reply when a knock at the door interrupted us. We both turned to see our neighbor, Matthew, leaning against the doorframe with a smug grin on his face. Everything all right in here? He asked, his eyes darting between us. I couldn't help but overhear. I glared at him, suddenly putting two and two together. The condoms, Kathleen's dismissive attitude, Matthew's arrogant smirk. It all clicked into place. You, I growled. It was you, wasn't it? Matthew's grin widened. That's definitely my size, he said, nodding at the condom still in my hand. You've got a tiny one, pal. By the way, last night was amazing. I saw red. Without thinking, I lunged at Matthew, my fist connecting with his jaw. He stumbled back, but quickly recovered, throwing a punch of his own. We grappled, trading blows, knocking over furniture as we fought. I could hear Kathleen yelling in the background, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was wiping that smug grin off Matthew's face. You son of a bitch, I yelled, landing another punch to his gut. She's my wife. Matthew laughed, even as he winced from the blow. Not for long, I bet. Face it, Hopkins. You can't satisfy her like I can. I roared in anger, tackling him to the ground. We rolled around on the floor, punching and kicking. our grunts, and the sound of flesh hitting flesh filling the air. By now, a small crowd had gathered outside our house, drawn by the commotion. I could hear gasps and murmurs, but I didn't care. All that mattered was making Matthew pay for what he'd done. Finally, exhausted and battered, we both lay on the floor, panting heavily. Matthew's eye was swollen shut, and I could taste blood in my mouth. All right, Matthew groaned, holding up his hands. Truce? I glared at him, wanting nothing more than to continue pummeling him. But I knew if I did, one of us would end up in the hospital or worse. Fine, I spat. But this isn't over. We both struggled to our feet, eyeing each other warily. The neighbors were still watching, wide-eyed and whispering among themselves. Show's over, folks. I called out to them, my voice hoarse. Nothing to see here. Matthew stumbled towards the door, pausing to look back at me. I won't press charges if you don't, he said. I nodded curtly. As much as I wanted to see him rot in a cell, I knew involving the police would only complicate things further. As Matthew left, I turned to face Kathleen. She stood there, arms crossed, looking more annoyed than remorseful. Was that really necessary? She asked, gesturing at the mess we'd made of the living room. I stared at her in disbelief. Was that necessary? You cheated on me, Kathleen, with our neighbor, and you're worried about the fucking furniture? She shrugged. What's done is done. Maybe if you'd been man enough to satisfy me, none of this would have happened. I felt a fresh wave of anger wash over me. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Excuse me? Kathleen raised an eyebrow. I said, get out. I roared. I can't even look at you right now. Pack a bag and leave. We'll figure out the rest later. For a moment, I thought she might argue. But then she turned on her heel and marched upstairs. I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of a suitcase being zipped. A few minutes later, she came back down, suitcase in hand. She paused at the door, looking back at me. You know, Marshall, she said, her voice cold. You might think you're the victim here, but really, you brought this on yourself. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me instead of your precious job, things might have been different. I laughed bitterly. Is that how you're justifying this to yourself? By blaming me? Get out, Kathleen, and don't come back. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, then thought better of it. Without another word, she walked out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there in the wreckage of our living room, surrounded by the remnants of what I thought was a happy marriage. As the adrenaline wore off, the pain from the fight started to set in. My knuckles were bruised and bleeding, my jaw ached, and I could feel a lump forming on the back of my head where I'd hit the coffee table. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. How could she do this? How could she throw away everything we'd built together? I stumbled to the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of whiskey from the top shelf. I didn't bother with a glass, just took a long swig straight from the bottle. The liquor burned going down, but I welcomed the pain. It was a distraction from the turmoil in my mind. As I sank onto the couch, bottle in hand, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let this break me. I wouldn't give Kathleen or Matthew the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. No, I'd pick myself up, dust myself off, and come back stronger than ever. And when I did, they'd both regret the day they decided to cross Marshall Hopkins. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a stiff neck from sleeping on the couch. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and for a moment, I hoped it had all been a bad dream. But the overturned furniture and the empty whiskey bottle on the coffee table told me otherwise. Groaning, I pushed myself up and stumbled to the bathroom. The face that greeted me in the mirror was a mess of split lip, a bruise blooming on my cheek, and eyes bloodshot from too much whiskey and not enough sleep. You look like shit, Hopkins, I muttered to my reflection as I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the remnants of last night. I heard a knock at the door. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking it might be Kathleen coming to her senses. But then I remembered her cold words, her utter lack of remorse, and my expression hardened. I trudged to the door, not bothering to put on a shirt. Whoever it was could deal with me as I was battered, hungover, and pissed off. I yanked the door open, ready to tell whoever it was to fuck off. But the words died in my throat when I saw who was standing there. Matthew, the arrogant bastard who'd fucked my wife and had the balls to brag about it to my face. He looked almost as bad as I did, his left eye swollen shut and a nasty cut across his cheek. But he still managed to smirk, which only reignited my anger. What the fuck do you want? I growled. Matthew held up his hands in a placating gesture. Easy there, tiger. I come in peace. I snorted. Peace? After what you did? You've got some nerve showing your face here. He shrugged, that infuriating smirk still on his face. What can I say? I'm a glutton for punishment. Mind if I come in? Actually, I do mind, I said, blocking the doorway with my body. Say whatever you came to say, and then get the hell off my property. Matthew sighed dramatically. Come on, Marshall. We're both adults here. Can't we discuss this civilly? I laughed bitterly. Civilly? You fucked my wife, you piece of shit. There's nothing civil about that. But that's where you're wrong, Matthew said, wagging a finger at me. It takes two to tango, my friend. Kathleen was more than willing. Eager, even. I felt my fists clench at my sides. You son of a... Now, Matthew interrupted. Let's not resort to name-calling. I just came to clear the air. Make sure we're on the same page about not pressing charges. I glared at him. Is that all? He grinned, and I had to resist the urge to punch him again. Well, that, and to return something of Kathleen's. She left it at my place last night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver necklace. I recognized it immediately. It was the anniversary gift I'd given Kathleen just a few months ago. You fucking bastard, I snarled, snatching the necklace from his hand. Matthew's grin widened. Oh, and Marshall? Just so you know, Kathleen's staying with me for a while. Hope you don't mind. That was it. All my resolve to handle this calmly went out the window. With a roar of rage, I lunged at Matthew, tackling him to the ground. We rolled around on my front lawn, trading punches and insults. I could hear neighbors shouting, telling us to stop, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was making Matthew pay for every snide comment, every smug look. You ruined my marriage, you asshole. I yelled, landing a solid punch to his already injured eye. Matthew laughed, even as he winced in pain. Your marriage was already ruined, pal. I just gave Kathleen what she needed. His words only fueled my anger. I grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the ground. What she needed? She's my wife. Not for long, Matthew gasped, still managing to smirk despite the beating he was taking. Face it, Hopkins. You couldn't satisfy her, but I could. I saw red. My fists flew, pummeling every inch of Matthew I could reach. I was vaguely aware of people trying to pull me off him, but I shrugged them off. Finally, exhausted and panting, I stumbled back. Matthew lay on the ground, groaning in pain. His face was a mess of blood and bruises, but somehow, he still managed to look smug. Feel better now, he wheezed. I spat on the ground next to him. Get off my property, and if I ever see you near my house again, I'll do worse than this. Matthew struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. You know, he said, wiping blood from his lip, Kathleen was right about you. You're all brawn and no brains. No wonder she came looking for something more stimulating. I took a threatening step towards him, and he quickly backpedaled. All right, I'm going. But this isn't over, Hopkins. I watched as he limped away, my chest heaving with exertion and rage. The neighbors were all out now, staring and whispering among themselves. Show's over, I growled at them. Go back to your lives. As I turned to go back inside, I caught sight of Mrs. Johnson. The sweet old lady who usually greeted me with a smile was now looking at me with a mixture of fear and disappointment. Marshall, she said softly, what's happened to you? I felt a pang of shame, but quickly pushed it down. They didn't understand. They hadn't had their lives torn apart in a single night. Without answering, I stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor, my head in my hands. The house felt empty, haunted by memories of what I thought was a happy life. Every corner seemed to mock me, reminding me of Kathleen's betrayal. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in a fog of anger and pain. The sound of my phone ringing finally roused me. I fished it out of my pocket, hoping against hope that it might be Kathleen coming to her senses. But the name on the screen made my heart sink even further. It was my boss. Hello? I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Marshall? Where the hell are you? You were supposed to be in a meeting an hour ago. I closed my eyes, realizing I'd completely forgotten about work. I'm sorry, sir. There's been a family emergency. Family emergency? My boss repeated skeptically. This better be good, Hopkins. You've never missed a day of work in your life. I took a deep breath. My wife, she's been having an affair with our neighbor. I just found out last night. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When my boss spoke again, his voice was softer. Jesus, Marshall, I'm sorry to hear that. Take the rest of the week off. Sort things out. We'll manage here. I nodded, forgetting he couldn't see me. Thanks, sir. I appreciate it. After hanging up, I dragged myself to the shower, hoping the hot water would wash away some of the pain and anger. It didn't. As I was drying off, I heard another knock at the door. My jaw clenched, thinking it might be Matthew again. But when I opened the door, I found a police officer standing there. Marshall Hopkins? He asked, his expression serious. I nodded, a sinking feeling in my stomach. That's me. What's this about? The officer pulled out a notepad. We received a call from your wife, Kathleen Hopkins. She's accusing you of assault. I stared at him in disbelief. What? That's ridiculous. I never laid a hand on her. Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down, the officer said, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Mrs. Hopkins claims you attacked her last night after discovering her affair. Given the visible injuries on both you and your neighbor, Mr. Matthew Clark, we have to take this seriously. I felt like I was in a nightmare. Officer, you've got it all wrong. I fought with Matthew, yes, but I never touched Kathleen. She's lying. The officer's expression remained impassive. I understand this is a difficult situation, Mr. Hopkins, but we have to follow procedure. I'm issuing a temporary restraining order. You'll need to vacate the premises immediately and have no contact with Mrs. Hopkins until this is sorted out. My world spun. You're kicking me out of my own house? Based on her lies? It's temporary, sir, the officer explained. Just until we can investigate fully. Do you have somewhere you can stay? I thought of my best friend, Otis. He'd let me crash at his place, no questions asked. Yeah, I muttered. I've got a place. The officer nodded. Good. You have an hour to pack your essentials and leave. We'll be waiting outside to ensure you comply. As the officer turned to leave, I called out, Wait, what about Matthew? Isn't he violating the restraining order by being at my house earlier? The officer frowned. Mr. Clark? He wasn't mentioned in the report. But if you'd like to file a complaint, you can do so at the station. I laughed bitterly. Of course, Kathleen had left that part out. Never mind, I said. I'll handle this myself. The officer gave me a warning look. I'd advise against any rash actions, Mr. Hopkins. It will only make things worse for you. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As soon as the door closed, I punched the wall, ignoring the pain that shot through my already bruised knuckles. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Just yesterday, I thought I had a loving wife and a happy life. Now, I was being kicked out of my own home, accused of a crime I didn't commit. With a heavy heart, I packed a bag with some clothes and essentials. As I was about to leave, my eyes fell on a framed photo of Kathleen and me on our wedding day. In a fit of rage, I smashed it against the wall, watching as the glass shattered and the frame splintered. Fuck you, Kathleen, I muttered, stepping over the broken glass and walking out of what used to be our home. The officer was waiting by his car, watching me closely. I tossed my bag into my car and got in without a word. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Matthew watching from his porch, that infuriating smirk still on his face despite his injuries. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I pulled up to Otis's house, my mind still reeling from the events of the past 24 hours. Otis was already waiting on the porch, concern etched on his face. He must have seen the state I was in because he didn't say a word, just opened the door and ushered me inside. Once we were settled in his living room, beers in hand, I spilled the whole sordid tale. Otis listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. Jesus, Marshall, that's some heavy shit. I took a long swig of my beer. Tell me about it. I still can't believe Kathleen would do this. The affair was bad enough, but accusing me of assault? That's a whole new level of fucked up. Otis shook his head. Women, man, they'll break your heart and then kick you while you're down. No offense to the good ones out there, but your Kathleen? She's a piece of work. Ex-Kathleen, I corrected him. As far as I'm concerned, she's dead to me. Otis nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. You can't let her get away with this shit. You need to fight back. I sighed. I know, but how? She's got me kicked out of my own house. The cops believe her story. Hell, even the neighbors probably think I'm some kind of wife-beater now. Otis leaned forward, a glint in his eye. You need a lawyer, my friend. And not just any lawyer. You need a shark. Someone who'll tear Kathleen's lies apart and leave her with nothing. I considered his words. He was right, of course. I couldn't let Kathleen win this. Not after what she'd done. You know anyone? I asked. Otis grinned. As a matter of fact, I do. Remember Annabelle? My eyebrows shot up. Your ex? The one who became a hotshot divorce attorney? The very same, Otis confirmed. She's ruthless in court. Exactly what you need right now. I hesitated. Annabelle and I had history. We dated briefly in college before she and Otis got together. It had been years, but still. Otis seemed to read my mind. Ancient history, man. She's a professional. And right now, you need the best. I nodded slowly. All right. Set it up. Otis pulled out his phone, dialing a number from memory. As he talked to Annabelle, arranging a meeting, I found myself thinking back to our college days. Annabelle had always been ambitious, driven. If anyone could help me out of this mess, it was her. Otis hung up, turning to me with a triumphant smile. She'll see you tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. Thanks, man. I don't know what I'd do without you. Otis clapped me on the shoulder. That's what friends are for. Now, how about we order some pizza and try to take your mind off things for a bit? As we settled in for a night of junk food and mindless TV, I found myself grateful for Otis's unwavering support. With him in my corner and Annabelle on the case, maybe I stood a chance of coming out of this mess in one piece. The next morning, I woke up early, my stomach in knots. I showered and dressed in my best suit, determined to make a good impression on Annabelle. This meeting could be the turning point in my fight against Kathleen's lies. Otis drove me to Annabelle's office, giving me a pep talk along the way. Remember, Marshall, Annabelle's on your side. Be honest with her, tell her everything. She can't help you if she doesn't have all the facts. I nodded, taking a deep breath as we pulled up to a sleek office building. Thanks, Otis. For everything. He grinned. Don't mention it. Now go in there and start planning your comeback. I walked into the building, my heart pounding. The receptionist directed me to Annabelle's office on the top floor. As the elevator climbed, I steeled myself for what was to come. The doors opened, and there she was. Annabelle hadn't changed much since college. Still beautiful, still radiating confidence. But now there was a sharpness to her, a predatory gleam in her eye that said she was ready for battle. Marshall, she greeted me, her voice cool and professional. It's been a long time. I nodded, suddenly feeling tongue-tied. Annabelle, thanks for seeing me on such short notice. She gestured for me to sit. Otis filled me in on the basics. Cheating wife, false accusations, restraining order. Quite the mess you've found yourself in. I winced at her blunt assessment. Yeah, it's been a hell of a few days. Annabelle leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. I'm sorry you're going through this, Marshall. But if you want my help, I need you to tell me everything. And I mean everything. No holding back, no sugarcoating. Can you do that? I took a deep breath, then launched into the whole sordid tale. Annabelle listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, she sat back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "All right," she said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we need to protect your assets. I'm going to file for an emergency hearing to freeze your joint accounts and credit cards. We can't have Kathleen emptying your bank account while you're locked out of the house." I nodded, feeling a surge of satisfaction at the thought of cutting off Kathleen's funds. "What else?" "We need evidence," Annabelle continued. "Right now, it's your word against hers. We need to prove she's lying about the assault. Do you have any security cameras at your house? Anything that might have captured what really happened that night?" I shook my head, frustrated. "No, nothing like that." Annabelle tapped her pen against her desk. "What about neighbors? Did anyone witness your fight with Matthew?" "Yeah, half the neighborhood was out there gawking," I replied. "But I don't know if any of them would be willing to testify. They all looked at me like I was some kind of monster." "We'll work on that," Annabelle assured me. "In the meantime, I want you to write down everything you can remember about that night. Every detail, no matter how small." "And Marshall?" I looked up, meeting her intense gaze. "Yeah. No matter what happens, no matter how tempted you might be, do not contact Kathleen. Don't call her, don't text her, don't even think about going near your house. One wrong move, and we could lose everything. Understood?" I nodded grimly. Understood. As I left Annabelle's office, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that I finally had someone fighting in my corner, anger at the injustice of it all, and a burning desire for revenge. Kathleen thought she could ruin my life and get away with it? She had no idea what was coming. With Annabelle's help, I was going to fight back. And when the dust settled, Kathleen would be the one left with nothing. I climbed into Otis's waiting car, a grim smile on my face. "How'd it go?" he asked. "It went well," I replied. "Annabelle's good. Really good. She's already got a plan to start fighting back." Otis grinned. "That's my girl. So, what's next?" I looked out the window, my resolve hardening. Now? Now we go to war. I sat in Otis's living room, staring at my phone. Annabelle had texted, saying she'd filed the emergency motion to freeze the joint accounts. Now we were waiting for the judge's decision. "Any word yet?" Otis asked, handing me a beer. I shook my head. "Nothing. How long does this usually take?" Otis shrugged. "Depends on the judge. Could be hours, could be days." Just then, my phone buzzed. I snatched it up, reading Annabelle's message. "Well?" Otis leaned forward expectantly. "It's done," I said, a smile spreading across my face. "The accounts are frozen. Kathleen can't touch a cent." Otis hooped, clapping me on the back. "That's what I'm talking about. How's it feel to start fighting back?" "Damn good," I admitted. "But this is just the beginning. We need more." As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Annabelle. "Marshall," she said when I answered. "I've got news. Good and bad. Which do you want first?" "Hit me with the bad," I replied, bracing myself. "Kathleen's lawyer reached out. They're pushing for a quick divorce settlement. They're claiming you were emotionally abusive throughout the marriage, and that's why Kathleen sought comfort elsewhere." I felt my blood boil. That lying bitch. "Calm down," Annabelle said firmly. "This is just a tactic. They're trying to paint you as the villain to get a better settlement. But here's the good news. Their rush to settle means they're scared. They know their case is weak." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think rationally. "So what's our next move?" "We need more evidence," Annabelle replied. "Anything that proves Kathleen's infidelity and discredits her abuse claims. Do you have access to any of her accounts? Email, social media, anything?" I thought for a moment. "I know her passwords. We used to share everything." "Perfect," Annabelle said. "Get into those accounts. Look for any evidence of her affair with Matthew. Text messages, emails, photos, anything that proves she was lying about the abuse. But Marshall, be careful. We need to do this right, or it could backfire." "I understand," I said. "I'll be discreet." After hanging up, I filled Otis in on the plan. Hacking her accounts? Otis whistled. "That's some spy movie shit right there." I grinned. Sometimes you gotta fight dirty to win. Just then, there was a pounding on the front door. Otis and I exchanged wary glances. "You expecting anyone?" I asked. Otis shook his head, moving cautiously towards the door. He peered through the peephole, then turned to me with a grimace. It's Kathleen. My jaw clenched. What the hell is she doing here? Want me to tell her to fuck off? Otis offered. I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. No. Let her in. I want to hear what she has to say. Otis raised an eyebrow but complied, opening the door. Kathleen stormed in, her face flushed with anger. You bastard, she spat at me. How dare you freeze our accounts? I leaned back in my chair, affecting a calm I didn't feel. Our accounts? I thought you were all about independence now, Kathleen. Or does that only apply when you're screwing the neighbor? She advanced on me, finger pointing accusingly. You think this is funny? I can't access any of our money? Sounds like a personal problem to me, I replied coolly. Maybe Matthew can help you out. He seems pretty generous with his assets. Kathleen's eyes narrowed. You won't get away with this, Marshall. I'll tell everyone what a monster you really are. I stood up slowly, towering over her. Go ahead. Tell them. Tell them how I worked my ass off to provide for us while you were spreading your legs for the neighbor. Tell them how I never laid a hand on you. But you still accused me of assault. Go on, Kathleen. I dare you. For a moment, I saw fear flash in her eyes. Then it was replaced by cold determination. This isn't over, Marshall. You'll regret this. As she turned to leave, I called out, Oh, Kathleen, you might want to change your passwords. You never know who might be snooping around. The color drained from her face. Without another word, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Otis let out a low whistle. Damn, Marshall. That was cold. I sank back into my chair, suddenly feeling drained. She made her choice, Otis. Now she has to live with the consequences. So what now? Otis asked. I pulled out my laptop. Now, we start digging. For the next few hours, Otis and I combed through Kathleen's accounts. Her emails were a goldmine of incriminating evidence, flirty exchanges with Matthew going back months, plans for secret rendezvous, even discussions about how to hide their affair from me. Jesus, Otis muttered, reading over my shoulder. How long has this been going on? I clenched my jaw, fighting back the wave of anger and betrayal. Looks like at least 6 months, maybe longer. As we dug deeper, we uncovered a folder of photos and videos. I hesitated, my cursor hovering over the file. You sure you want to see this, man? Otis asked gently. I took a deep breath. I have to. We need all the evidence we can get. With a click, the folder opened, revealing dozens of explicit images and videos of Kathleen and Matthew together. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to document everything, saving copies to a secure cloud storage. This is it, I said, my voice tight with suppressed emotion. This proves everything. The affair, the lies, all of it. Otis squeezed my shoulder. You okay, buddy? I nodded stiffly. I will be, once I've made them pay for this. Just then, my phone rang. It was Annabelle. Marshall, she said when I answered. How's the evidence gathering going? We hit the jackpot, I replied. Emails, photos, videos, you name it, we've got it. Kathleen and Matthew's affair is documented in full, going back at least 6 months. I could practically hear Annabelle smile through the phone. Excellent work. This changes everything. With this evidence, we can not only disprove Kathleen's abuse claims, but also push for a much more favorable divorce settlement. What's our next move? I asked, feeling a surge of hope for the first time in days. We present this evidence to Kathleen's lawyer, Annabelle replied. Give them a chance to settle quietly. If they refuse, we take it to court and let a judge see exactly what kind of person Kathleen really is. I grinned. I like the sound of that. After hanging up, I filled Otis in on the plan. Sounds like you've got them by the balls, Otis said approvingly. But what about Matthew? That smarmy bastard deserves to pay too. I leaned back, a plan forming in my mind. Oh, don't worry. I've got something special in mind for our dear neighbor. Just then, there was another knock at the door. Otis and I exchanged wary glances. Kathleen again? Otis asked. I shook my head. No way. She wouldn't come back so soon. Cautiously, Otis approached the door and peered through the peephole. His eyebrows shot up. It's Matthew. My fists clenched involuntarily. Let him in. Otis hesitated. You sure about that? I nodded. Oh yeah. I've got a few things I'd like to say to Mr. Clark. Otis shrugged and opened the door. Matthew swaggered in. His face still bruised from our last encounter, but his arrogant smirk firmly in place. Well, well, he drawled. If it isn't the cuckold and his faithful sidekick. I rose slowly, fixing Matthew with a cold stare. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Clark. Matthew spread his hands in a mock, placating gesture. Hey, I'm just here to talk. Maybe work out a little arrangement. I raised an eyebrow. Arrangement? This ought to be good. Matthew's smirk widened. It's simple, really. You drop this whole legal circus, give Kathleen what she wants in the divorce, and in return. Well, let's just say certain embarrassing videos won't find their way to your workplace, family, and friends. I felt a surge of satisfaction. This idiot had no idea what we just uncovered. That's an interesting offer, Matthew, I said, keeping my voice level. But I've got a counter-proposal for you. Matthew's smirk faltered slightly. Oh yeah? And what's that? I stepped closer, enjoying the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. You go home, pack your bags, and get the hell out of town. Because if you don't, every single person in your life, your family, your friends, your co-workers, they're all going to see exactly what kind of man you really are. Matthew's cocky facade crumbled. What are you talking about? I smiled coldly. Check your email, Matthew. I think you'll find a very interesting message waiting for you. Consider it a preview of what's to come if you don't disappear. Fast. The color drained from Matthew's face as realization dawned. Without another word, he turned and fled, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to leave. Otis burst out laughing as soon as the door slammed shut. Holy shit, Marshall. Did you see his face? I thought he was going to piss himself. I allowed myself a chuckle. That's just the beginning. By the time I'm done with him and Kathleen, they'll wish they'd never crossed me. As the laughter subsided, Otis fixed me with a serious look. You know this isn't over, right? They're gonna fight back? I nodded, my resolve hardening. Let them try. We've got the truth on our side now, and I'm done playing nice. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I felt a mix of anticipation and dread as Annabelle and I walked into the courthouse. Kathleen and her lawyer were already there, along with Matthew, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Remember, Annabelle murmured as we took our seats, let me do the talking. No matter what they say, stay calm. I nodded, my jaw clenched tightly. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, I forced myself to breathe steadily, reminding myself that we held all the cards. Kathleen's lawyer went first, painting a picture of me as a controlling, emotionally abusive husband who had driven Kathleen into the arms of another man. I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from jumping up and calling out their lies. Then it was Annabelle's turn. She stood, cool and composed, and began to systematically dismantle every claim Kathleen's side had made. Your Honor, Annabelle said, her voice clear and confident, the defense would like to present evidence that not only disproves Mrs. Hopkins' claims of abuse, but also demonstrates a pattern of infidelity and deceit on her part. She proceeded to lay out the emails, photos, and videos we discovered, each piece of evidence landing like a bombshell in the courtroom. I watched with satisfaction as Kathleen's face grew paler with each revelation. Furthermore, Annabelle continued, we have testimony from Mr. Hopkins' ex-girlfriend, who can attest to his character and confirm that he has never exhibited abusive tendencies. I blinked in surprise. This was news to me. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened and a familiar face walked in. It was Sarah, my college girlfriend from before Kathleen. Sarah took the stand, looking nervous but determined. I dated Marshall for 2 years in college, she began. He was always kind, respectful, and supportive. The man Mrs. Hopkins describes bears no resemblance to the Marshall I knew. As Sarah continued her testimony, I caught Kathleen glaring at me from across the room. I met her gaze steadily, letting her see that her lies and manipulations had failed. Finally, Annabelle played her trump card, the doorbell camera footage from the night Kathleen had come to Otis's house. Your Honor, Annabelle said, This footage clearly shows Mrs. Hopkins violating the restraining order she herself requested. More importantly, it captures her assaulting Mr. Hopkins and admitting to her affair. As the video played, showing Kathleen hitting me with her purse and taunting me about her relationship with Matthew, a hush fell over the courtroom. Even the judge looked shocked. When the proceedings ended, the judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Kathleen's claims of abuse were dismissed, and she was found guilty of filing a false report and violating the restraining order. She was sentenced to community service and ordered to pay a substantial fine. As we left the courtroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Annabelle squeezed my arm, smiling. "We did it, Marshall. It's over." But as we walked out of the courthouse, Kathleen's voice rang out behind us. "This isn't over, Marshall. In family court, I'll take everything from you." I turned to face her, my expression cold. "Bring it on, Kathleen. You've already shown the world who you really are. There's nothing left for you to take." As Kathleen stormed off, Matthew trailing behind her like a whipped dog, I felt a surge of determination. This battle was won, but the war wasn't over, and I was just getting started. The courtroom victory was sweet, but I knew it was just the beginning. Kathleen's threat to take everything in family court still rang in my ears. I wasn't about to let that happen. "So, what's the plan now?" Otis asked as we sat in his living room, celebrating our win. I took a swig of beer and grinned. "Now, we go on the offensive. It's time to show Kathleen and Matthew exactly what happens when you cross Marshall Hopkins." Otis leaned forward, intrigued. "I'm listening." "First things first," I said, pulling out my phone. "We're going to share the evidence of their affair with everyone they know." Otis whistled. "That's cold, man. I love it." I scrolled through my contacts, finding Kathleen's parents' number. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson? It's Marshall. I think there's something you need to see." Over the next hour, I called or messaged everyone in Kathleen's social circle, her parents, siblings, cousins, friends, even her boss. Each time, I sent carefully selected pieces of evidence from our treasure trove of incriminating material. "Marshall," Kathleen's mother sobbed over the phone. "I can't believe she would do this. We raised her better than that." "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I replied, not feeling sorry at all. "But I thought you deserved to know the truth." As I hung up, Otis shook his head in admiration. "Man, you're not pulling any punches." "They didn't pull any punches with me," I retorted. "Why should I show them mercy?" Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Kathleen. "You bastard. What have you done?" I chuckled, showing the message to Otis. "Looks like the news is spreading fast." Otis grinned. "Want to rub some salt in the wound?" I nodded, dialing Kathleen's number. She picked up on the first ring. "How dare you?" she screeched. "You had no right to share those private messages and photos." "No right?" I laughed coldly. "That's rich coming from you, Kathleen. You had no right to cheat on me, lie about me, or try to ruin my life. Consider this karma. You've ruined everything," she wailed. "My family won't talk to me. My friends are all blocking me on social media. Even my boss is talking about reevaluating my position because of the scandal." I felt a surge of satisfaction. Sounds like a personal problem to me. Maybe Matthew can help you out. "Oh wait, I'm not done with him yet." "What are you talking about?" Kathleen's voice was suddenly wary. "You'll see," I replied cryptically. "Sweet dreams, Kathleen. Enjoy your new life as a social pariah." I hung up, feeling more alive than I had in weeks. Otis was looking at me with a mixture of awe and concern. "You okay, man?" he asked. "This is a pretty hardcore revenge plot you're running here." I met his gaze steadily. "I've never been better. They tried to destroy me, Otis. Now I'm returning the favor." Otis nodded slowly. "All right, I'm with you. What's next on the agenda?" I pulled out my laptop. Now we deal with Matthew. Time to hit him where it really hurts in the wallet. I logged into my email and composed a message to Matthew's employer, attaching select pieces of evidence that showed not only Matthew's affair with a married woman, but also his aggressive behavior and threats. "You really think his boss will fire him over this?" Otis asked, reading over my shoulder. I shrugged. "Maybe not immediately, but it'll plant the seed. And if I know corporate types, they'll start looking for a reason to get rid of him. As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Matthew. "You son of a bitch," he snarled as soon as I answered. "My boss just called me in for a serious discussion about my recent behavior." "What did you do?" I couldn't help but smile. "I simply shared some pertinent information about your character, Matthew. Is that a problem?" "You're trying to get me fired," he yelled. Now, I said, feigning concern. "I'm sure a man of your talents won't have any trouble finding new employment. Maybe Kathleen can support you with her waitressing tips." Matthew's voice dropped to a menacing growl. "You think this is funny? I'll make you regret this, Hopkins. I swear to God, You'll what?" I interrupted, my own voice hardening. "Go ahead, Matthew. Make a threat. Give me one more piece of evidence to use against you. I dare you." There was a long pause, then a string of curses before Matthew hung up. Otis let out a low whistle. "Damn, Marshall. You're like a one-man wrecking crew." I leaned back, feeling a sense of satisfaction. "I'm just getting started, Otis. By the time I'm done, Kathleen and Matthew will wish they'd never met each other or me." As the days passed, reports trickled in from various sources. Kathleen had been ostracized by her social circle, forced to change her phone number due to the constant barrage of angry calls and messages. Matthew was on thin ice at work, his boss watching him like a hawk for any slip-up. It was all going according to plan, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. "You know," Otis said one evening as we were reviewing our handiwork, "most people would be satisfied by now. You've pretty much destroyed their lives." I shook my head. "It's not enough. They need to feel the same pain, the same helplessness I felt when they betrayed me. And I won't stop until they do." Otis studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, man. I'm with you to the end. What's our next move?" I grinned, a plan already forming in my mind. Now we hit them where it really hurts their future. The day of the divorce settlement hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom with Annabelle by my side, feeling confident. Despite our previous victories, I knew Kathleen wouldn't go down without a fight. "Remember," Annabelle murmured as we took our seats, "stay calm no matter what happens. We've got this." I nodded, my jaw set with determination. Across the aisle, Kathleen sat with her lawyer, looking pale and drawn. Good, I thought. Let her suffer. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Kathleen's lawyer made an impassioned plea for a generous settlement, citing Kathleen's emotional distress and loss of reputation due to the public exposure of her affair. When it was Annabelle's turn, she calmly dismantled each of their arguments, presenting evidence of Kathleen's infidelity and deceit. "Your Honor," Annabelle concluded, "given Mrs. Hopkins' actions and the evidence we've presented, we believe Mr. Hopkins should retain the majority of the marital assets." The judge looked thoughtful, then turned to me. "Mr. Hopkins, do you have anything to add?" I stood, meeting the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, I worked hard for everything we had. Kathleen threw it all away for a fling with the neighbor. She made her choice, and now she has to live with the consequences." The judge nodded, then delivered his ruling. To my dismay, he ordered a 50-50 split of our assets, citing the no-fault divorce laws of our state. As we left the courtroom, I couldn't hide my frustration. How is this fair? I growled to Annabelle. After everything she did? Annabelle squeezed my arm sympathetically. "I know it feels unfair, Marshall, but look at it this way: you're free of her now. You can move on and rebuild." I nodded, but inwardly, I was seething. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that evening, as I paced in Otis's living room, my phone pinged with a notification. It was from one of Kathleen's social media accounts that I still had access to. "What's up?" Otis asked, noting my sudden interest. I grinned, showing him the screen. "Looks like Kathleen and Matthew are planning a little celebration trip to Bali. With my money." Otis whistled. "That's gotta sting. What are you gonna do about it?" I sat down at my laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'm going to make sure they never forget this trip." Over the next hour, I systematically canceled their flight reservations, hotel bookings, and even their travel insurance. Then, just for good measure, I reported their credit cards as stolen. "There," I said, leaning back with satisfaction. "Let's see them enjoy Bali now." Otis laughed. Man, you are cold. I love it. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of angry texts and voicemails from Kathleen. You think this is funny? She screeched in one message. We're stranded at the airport because of you. I chuckled, showing the messages to Otis. Shall we go pay them a visit? Otis grinned. This I gotta see. We arrived at the airport to find Kathleen and Matthew arguing with a harried-looking airline employee. I sauntered up, enjoying the look of fury that crossed their faces when they saw me. Having some travel troubles? I asked innocently. Kathleen whirled on me. You did this. I know you did. I shrugged. I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe it's just karma catching up with you. Matthew stepped forward, fists clenched. You son of a… I interrupted, wagging a finger. Careful, Matthew. We wouldn't want a repeat of our last physical disagreement, especially not in front of all these nice people and security cameras. Matthew's face turned an interesting shade of purple, but he backed down. You won't get away with this, Kathleen hissed. I laughed. Get away with what? I'm just an innocent bystander, watching karma unfold. Enjoy your staycation. As Otis and I walked away, leaving Kathleen and Matthew to deal with their ruined plans, I felt a sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. So what's next? Otis asked as we got in the car. I grinned. Now we go for the knockout punch. I've got a little surprise planned for their business venture. Otis raised an eyebrow. Business venture? Oh, didn't I mention? I said innocently. Our dear Kathleen and Matthew are planning to buy a cafe. With my money, of course. But they're not planning to run it, they're going to flip it for a quick profit. Otis whistled. Sneaky. So what are you going to do? I started the car, my mind already racing with possibilities. I'm going to make sure their little business adventure turns into a nightmare they'll never forget. Over the next few days, I put my plan into action. Using the information I'd gathered from Kathleen's accounts, I tracked down the cafe they were planning to buy. Then, I reached out to the current owner. Mr. Johnson, this is Marshall Hopkins. I understand you're in talks to sell your cafe to Kathleen Thompson and Matthew Clark? The owner confirmed, sounding cautious. I thought you should know, I continued, that they're planning to flip the property for a quick profit. They have no intention of running the business. There was a long pause. How do you know this? Mr. Johnson asked. Let's just say I have insider information, I replied. I can provide proof if you'd like. After sending Mr. Johnson some carefully selected evidence, I sat back and waited. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. My phone rang late that evening. It was Kathleen. What did you do? She demanded as soon as I picked up. I feigned innocence. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Kathleen. Don't play dumb, she snarled. The cafe owner just backed out of the sale. He said someone told him about our plans to flip the property. I couldn't help but chuckle. Well. Looks like your get-rich-quick scheme has hit a snag. How unfortunate. You're ruining everything. Kathleen's voice cracked with frustration. Why can't you just leave us alone? Leave you alone? I repeated, my voice hardening. Like you left me alone when you were screwing Matthew behind my back? Or when you tried to destroy my reputation with false abuse claims? No, Kathleen. I'm just getting started. I hung up. Otis, who had been listening to my side of the conversation, shook his head in admiration. Man, you are on a roll, he said. But don't you think this is enough? You've pretty much destroyed their lives at this point. I turned to him, my expression serious. It's not about destroying their lives, Otis. It's about justice. They tried to take everything from me, my home, my reputation, my future. Now I'm making sure they feel the same pain, the same helplessness. Otis nodded slowly. I get it, man. I just hope you know when to stop. I grinned, but there was no humor in it. Oh, I'll stop. When they've lost everything, just like they tried to do to me. As the days turned into weeks, reports trickled in about Kathleen and Matthew's downward spiral. Their attempt to buy another cafe fell through when word spread about their previous scheme. Matthew, already on thin ice at work, was finally fired when he lost his temper with a client. And through it all, I watched and waited, my thirst for revenge far from quenched. 3 years passed in a blur of hard work and determination. I'd moved to a new city, throwing myself into building a new business from the ground up. The pain of Kathleen's betrayal had faded, replaced by a satisfaction as reports of her and Matthew's struggles reached me through various channels. Otis had moved to the same city, our friendship stronger than ever. We were having our weekly dinner when he brought up the topic I'd been avoiding. "Heard anything about Kathleen lately?" he asked casually. I shrugged, taking a sip of my beer. "Not much. Last I heard, she and Matthew were struggling to keep that cafe afloat." Otis leaned forward, a glint in his eye. "Well, I've got some news for you. Matthew split town about 6 months ago. Left Kathleen high and dry." I raised an eyebrow, trying to hide my interest. "Is that so?" "Yep," Otis continued. "And get this, Kathleen's working as a waitress now, at that very same cafe they bought." I couldn't help but laugh. Well, well, how the mighty have fallen. Otis studied me for a moment. "You know, we're not far from your old hometown. Ever think about paying a visit? See the fallout for yourself?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave the past in the past. But another part, the part that still burned with the memory of Kathleen's betrayal, was intrigued. "You know what? Why not?" I said finally. "Let's take a little trip down memory lane." The next day, Otis and I found ourselves sitting in a booth at the rundown cafe that had once been Kathleen and Matthew's dream. The place was nearly empty, the few patrons looking as tired and worn as the peeling wallpaper. And there she was, Kathleen, looking years older than when I'd last seen her, wearing a stained apron and a defeated expression. She did a double take when she saw us, nearly dropping her tray of dishes. Marshall," she stammered. "What are you doing here?" I leaned back, enjoying her discomfort. "Just passing through town. Thought I'd stop by for a cup of coffee. Hear you make a mean latte these days." Kathleen flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her tray. I don't." "What's the matter, Kathleen?" I asked, my voice dripping with false concern. "Cat got your tongue? You used to be so quick with words, especially when you were lying to my face." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Marshall, please." I leaned forward, my voice low and cold. "Please what, Kathleen? Please forgive you for destroying our marriage? For lying to me? For trying to take everything I had?" Tears welled up in her eyes. I made a mistake. I'm sorry." Otis snorted beside me, but I held up a hand, silencing him. "I wanted to hear this." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call it?" Kathleen's shoulders slumped. She looked around nervously, clearly afraid her manager might catch her talking to customers. "Marshall, I know I hurt you. I've paid for it. Look at me now. I've lost everything." I leaned back, studying her. The years hadn't been kind. The confident, manipulative woman I'd known was gone, replaced by this shell of a person. "You brought this on yourself, Kathleen," I said finally. "You and Matthew both." At the mention of Matthew's name, Kathleen's face crumpled. "He left me," she whispered. "Once the money was gone, he was gone too." I felt a flicker of pity, but I squashed it ruthlessly. "Karma's a bitch, isn't it?" Kathleen wiped her eyes, smearing her cheap mascara. "I know I don't deserve it, but is there any chance you could forgive me? Maybe we could start over." I stared at her, incredulous. Was she serious? After everything she'd done, did she really think I'd consider taking her back? I stood up slowly, Otis following suit. "No, Kathleen. There's no starting over. What's done is done. I've moved on with my life, and I suggest you do the same." As we walked towards the door, I heard her call out one last time. "Marshall, wait." I paused, turning back to look at her. For a moment, I saw a flash of the woman I'd once loved, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the reality of what she'd become. "Goodbye, Kathleen," I said firmly. "I hope you find peace with your choices." As Otis and I stepped out into the sunlight, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The last ties to my past had been severed. "You okay, man?" Otis asked, clapping me on the shoulder. I took a deep breath, then smiled. "Yeah, I am. For the first time in a long time, I really am." We walked down the street, leaving the cafe and Kathleen behind. I had a new life now, one built on the ashes of betrayal but forged in determination and self-respect. As we headed back to our new home, I felt nothing but gratitude for the friends who'd stood by me and the strength I'd found within myself. The future was bright, and I was ready to embrace it alone, but stronger than ever. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.